He has been a champion on business issues. He has more awards and plaques from associated industry at our various groups than I do from 18 years in public service. Well deserved, by the way. He is our go-to guy on a number of policy issues, and threw his name in the ring to become Florida's next Secretary of Agriculture. And so we are thrilled to announce that our board today instructed me to let you know, and we will be letting our friends and the press know that Associated Industries enthusiastically endorses your candidacy to be our next Agriculture Commissioner. So thanks for all you've done for us. And you have been a champion of water policy, of Everglades land restoration, of land preservation in Florida, and you've done it in a way that is based on good scientific and environmental sustainability policy. You certainly haven't looked at the business community as an enemy, but rather as a part of the solution to environmental and land use challenges throughout the state. What types of things would you prioritize in the area of land use and water policy that is so unique in Florida from the other 49 states? What types of things do you expect to focus on for your tenure?
Sure, Tom, and look, I'm excited. By the way, I'd be remiss if I didn't say how fantastic a nominee we've got in Ashley Moody for Attorney General. I look forward to serving with her, and we'll have Jimmy and Ron up here hopefully shortly after. I think we've got a great team who will be able to work well together on advancing this agenda. You know, the area of water, anybody that's followed the work that I've committed myself to the last 8 years, you can expect more of the same. The challenges are many. You take a place that had nobody in it. We've put 22 million so far. We're going to probably grow to 30 million people, and it manifests itself in many, many ways. We've got challenges on water supply. We're sitting here in Orlando. It is Orlando, right? Is that where I am right now?
I think we may be in Osceola County.
Osceola County. Well, we don't want to offend anybody.
It's the Orlando media market.
Orlando media market. We'll cover.
Yeah, you're spending TV ads in the Orlando market here.
Sure enough. But we've got challenges here with water supply. We're already at the supply limit for what exists for this region. We've been instituting policy. A big part of that water bill from 2016 was to try to draw this region together closer as a corporate group to advance their water supply needs and really start investing in infrastructure. We've obviously got water quality issues in South Florida, decisions that no individual person is responsible for. There's nobody alive today that set out that policy in 1845 that said to the federal government, give us the land and we're going to drain it to make it useful from our perspective, because only crazy people would live down there in the swamp. But we've got to inherit all of those challenges that come from that. I think, and I talk about this a lot, I get a chance to speak to groups all the time. Monday night we were with some nursery growers in Southwest Florida, and we spent about an hour just talking about the Everglades and the challenges we have there. And it's really dealing with decisions that were made long before any of us were in public service. The most ridiculous thing is to accuse anybody that's been in office in this last 8 years as being responsible for bad outcomes. Frankly, if we're responsible for anything, it's the progress we've finally made in the last 4 years, particularly on funding projects that are going to make a difference to this problem. I've been listening to it since I was in, first grade. 1987 is when the feds identified US 41 needed to be turned into a bridge. I was in first grade. And still no progress on that for almost 30 years until we took it seriously with the Governor Rick Scott's help on FDOT money. So that really, if you ask, what are you going to expect from a Matt Caldwell administration, the Commissioner of Agriculture's office, you're going to see water continue to be the #1 priority in my life and in my public service. I'll count it as a personal failure if 8 years from now I can't show you real appreciable accomplishments when it comes to water supply and water quality, and particularly the Everglades ecosystem, where I can point and say, I set out to see something done, and here's what we've got to show for it.
Well, that's great, and obviously we have a lot of our members that are interested in land use, that are major landowners, but all of us are dependent on water, and our issues are just so unique. Before we get back to the main thrust of what people know the Agriculture Commissioner to be responsible for, you're also the head of the Florida Department of Consumer Affairs. And how will you take your responsibilities in that regard when you're commissioner for the next few years?
Sure, and that manifests itself in so many different ways. You obviously have consumer complaint sides, and you've got to make sure that you're being responsive to the public, and that if there's legitimate complaints to be pursued, that they're being pursued. But then you have all the other, it catches also all the non-ag businesses. They get regulated by this department, and it's a huge profile. It's the number one challenge. So as I would go on the trail, we hit 90,000 miles throughout that primary. Anytime you were north of here, the first question I get is, where are you from? Because people that live particularly in our rural communities want to make sure that you have some kind of perspective on who they are and where they live, and want to make sure you're going to actually show up again sometime in the next 4 or 8 years if you do get elected. And then south of Orlando...
By the way, Browning says you even know where Palatka, Florida is.
Oh, that one's easy. Everybody knows where Palatka is. We got to get into real detailed ones like Tuag before we get to the hard questions. And then you go south of here and people say, what is that office again? Because they not only have no idea about the agriculture, but all the other responsibilities. So, the oil changes and the auto repair and the surveyors and the dance studios and the gas stations and the pawn shops, and because it had county fairs, and for ride safety, they oversee amusement parks. And so the profile is really enormous on just the impact to small and large businesses, but particularly small businesses. You go through all the list of those regulated industries, and it is overwhelmingly populated by small business owners who cannot sustain very easily silly and capricious actions on the part of the regulators and the part of the legislature. So I think when you're asking what I'd be paying attention to, it's having that continuing, actually, what I think is a positive working relationship with that business community. There's always going to be issues that have to be resolved, and it's an attitude question at the core. Are you going to have people operating in that position that are looking to help solve a problem and get to yes, or are you going to have people that just show up, write a citation, and then go on and clock out at 5 o'clock? And I think you need to have, obviously, the first example, and it's one that I'm committed to seeing continued and instituted as we move forward.
Well, your background, among other things, is a real estate appraiser. You've testified in court as an expert witness on multiple occasions, and we know that you've been a leader in policy decisions for your tenure in the Florida House. How does your professional background inform your decision-making as you take on new responsibilities after November?
Well, it was fascinating. My degree in college is in history, and what you get a history degree is you learn to research historical data, analyze it, and predict future trends. And whatever profession you end up in using it, and I would have never imagined it. Real estate appraisal is an apprenticeship career, so you don't actually go to school for it. You study, understudy for 2 to 3 years. But it ended up being an invaluable tool. I'm researching historical data and then telling people what's going to happen with their property. And those skills, I think, have translated well to the policymaking arena. When you go into particularly these very complicated, large policy debates that we've had to dive into and that I expect to still be a part of, particularly if I want to continue to elevate water and land use issues, you can't really understand how to solve that if you don't have any clue where it came from. If you don't understand why the system was built to what it is today, then how could you possibly figure out how to reform it or change it in a way that you think is positive? I think that skill set has benefited me greatly. And I think probably just something we don't think a lot about, but the cabinet does serve as the trustees of the Internal Improvement Trust Fund. It's the titled owner of all of the millions of acres of land that the state owns, and then also all the vertical real estate. So I'd like to think that I've got some fairly decent insight when it comes to just that management responsibility as a cabinet as we evaluate just the business decisions of what to do with all of this real estate portfolio. I certainly hope that it gives me some background and experience to make some pretty well-informed decisions.
Well, yeah, that is a useful background, particularly in Florida, where everybody and their uncle is one way or the other involved in the real estate business and transactions. You're no longer going to be passing legislation. some statewide candidates have called for a corporate income tax. And one of the defenses of, let's raise taxes on big business because small businesses don't pay it. It seems to me, given how many small businesses are dependent for the health of large businesses and large employers, and the more successful the big businesses are, the more small employers thrive and grow and new entrepreneurship is created. So do you have an opinion about the impact of a substantial increase in the corporate income taxes by roughly 40% is one of the proposals? And, is there anything that as Agriculture Commissioner you could do to sort of advise Floridians that it's not free money, that there is a price to pay if you're going to become more like New York or Illinois in your treatment of employers?
Well, Tom, you're pretty well informed the answer. I mean, it's a stupid proposal. Let's just be honest about that. Every bit of evidence that any objective person has looked at in the success or failure of states within the United States over the last several decades, it's clear that tax policy has been a major contributing factor as to why we've been successful and why states like Connecticut and New Jersey and New York are really a basket case. I mean, Connecticut's really a great example just within the last decade of having shifted from overwhelmingly had a pro-business policy, being a small state trying to attract large employers to headquarter there, and now having chased most or nearly all of them out with a severe shift in their tax policy. It doesn't, liberal or conservative, you've got to be just a complete ostrich with your head in the sand and not see how that directly impacts investment. And that's the last thing we want to do. There's the deeper understanding of how corporate tax is really just a pass-through tax on the consumers. It doesn't make any sense in terms of actually efficient tax collection, so it doesn't benefit us even in that way. But we've made our mark in the world by being a business-friendly, market-based economy in Florida. And so not only has that put us in a very competitive advantage compared to the other states in the union, but compared to the rest of the globe. And I certainly think we need to continue to be thinking bigger. I mean, we think about our role in the nation, and it's unique and it's incredible, it's beneficial, but we're a $1 trillion economy now as a state. I think, what was it, number 17 in the world measured by itself. That is incredibly impactful, and the opportunity that presents for us to grow even more so, not just from domestic influx, but our presence in the international market. We need to continue to commit to a very pro-business attitude, and certainly, to the second half of your question, how do you speak to that? I think, again, anybody that's followed my career, I'm not shy about speaking my mind about things that I believe in, so don't expect that to change.
Well, and you mentioned regulatory policy. I think as early as Ronald Reagan's tenure as president, he pointed out we had more people in the federal government regulating farmers and the production of food than we did farmers, and farming has become more efficient. But the consequence of that is there are fewer people in Florida and throughout the country that are actually from a farm and working on a farm and familiar with what's important to agriculture, which traditionally a very critical industry to Florida. A lot of, I've got two sons who think that food is just produced by their local, grocery store, and you just go pick it up through the fast food drive-in. So, the regulatory burdens, some of which have been relieved in the last year at the federal level, but like it or not, there's a huge popularity amongst voters in general to just punish somebody, and whether it's this industry or that industry, often it's the agriculture community. Do you have some thoughts on how, as Secretary of Agriculture, given how critical that position is to our state, how you could explain to voters that may not be sophisticated in good science or agricultural issues why it's so important that we have rational policy as opposed to just putting everything up to a 51% of vote who wants to turn your property into a bird sanctuary and a weed farm. It gets to be more complicated than that.
Well, it is Man, Tom, you're asking the question about every third word. I'm taking a new pathway down in my brain of how I want to tackle that. There's so much to it. We deal with the specific question in South Florida of this, false narrative of Everglades farmers versus the coast, which is total bunk, and anybody that's paid any kind of attention to it understands that. I always start with the brand new person, those, as you said earlier, 900 people a day that show up from somewhere else, and they've got no idea. I remind them, if you don't put chlorine in your pool, it's going to turn green within a week. The algae is always there, and it is all of us collectively that contribute to that. And then, of course, try to take the conversation whatever direction they need to be informed on. But the bigger questions about property rights, about how we're going to balance those. You look at the north end of the state in the Swanee Valley area. That's one of the few districts, water management districts, where agricultural consumption is still in the lead compared to most of the rest, where urban consumption is the number one consumer. But at the same time, that's a district where urban growth around its outsides are actually pushing in and creating a potential inflection point. What's fascinating about this position is all the different ways you can interact on all these different issues, and each one of them has a unique solution. What we need to do in Dade County in terms of how terrible their water supply infrastructure is, losing 50% or so of their actual potable water between the water plant and the faucet, that's a different question than investing in long-term supply facilities for Jacksonville so that their urban growth doesn't push in on the ag area in Swanee Valley. From the state perspective, I think that does involve some financial commitment and partnership. But first and foremost, as the titular head of the agricultural industry, the person that the press is going to call when these questions come up, it's incumbent upon me to be the one willing and able to talk about those issues and talk about them confidently. So I will tell you, a lot of time. We're doing it right now through this process. With as many people in the media, love it or not, they are the ones that control a lot of that information flow to the public, and we invest proactively. I have throughout my years in the House and continue in this cycle, in this phase, to try to educate the members of the press so that they understand the unique position that these different industries are in. But the fundamental thing is understanding there's not a conflict. I mean, if you want to see how you do it wrong, you look at California. California has mismanaged not only their policymaking, but just their basic infrastructure, planning for the future. You've got a scenario where the farming community has already been cut out, and it is a death struggle between the environmental demands and the urban growth there. And they're so far behind the eight ball, it's just a disaster. I would hate to have to inherit that. We don't want to end up there, and I think the right policy and the right investment, you end up in a scenario where urban, rural, and natural Florida's needs complement each other, and they work well together. And I think that's absolutely a future that we can not only aspire for, but we can achieve.
You've again been a leader on a lot of legislative issues important to the business community. Your relationships in the legislature are pretty good, and you know where the cog in the wheel is here and there, and untying the Gordian knots that pop up here and figuring out who tied them in the first place is often a challenge, whether you're inside the process or supporting the process from the outside like AIF does. How do you think your relations with legislators, both in the House and the Senate, can help you be more effective in sort of proactively having a pro-business and pro-landowner and pro-water conservation agenda, as opposed to just reacting as a part of the executive branch?
It's funny. It's just a typical story, I guess. As time evolves, when I was a freshman, I look back at the things I was able to get done. Nobody really paid attention to me. I could wander into a suite, say a couple of things to somebody I'd gotten to be friends with, and then walk away, and nobody would have noticed that I'd been there. And then, of course, as time goes on and people realize you're walking around the building, then, of course, you tackle bigger issues, and they're paying attention to you being the one putting the sticks in the cogs. It certainly was, I thoroughly enjoyed the time that I had the last 8 years. And I do benefit, I think, from having, as you say, a lot of really positive relationships. I always had an attitude that you can't you can't accomplish anything if you're not able to talk to all the players on the field. It's really not that big a universe. Talk about 160 people, 164, including the cabinet, 65 throwing the lieutenant governor if they're really empowered to be a part of that process. That's not a ton of people to have to get to know. And if you just take us, really, from my perspective, not a huge amount of time, but invest in each one of those relationships, you can see that pay off. I think you saw that in those complicated and difficult Everglades and water policy bills. We would pass those unanimously or nearly unanimously every time, bipartisan. And you don't win every fight, but I do think when it comes to some of the harder challenges that are going to present themselves in the coming years, having those positive relationships, not only with the people in leadership, but really up and down and throughout both chambers, I think will be a benefit.
Share with us, because it's a whole new set of responsibilities as you move to a full-time position, share with us the reaction of your family and the burdens that puts on both the campaign and then, we're hoping for the next 4, maybe 8 years.
It really, of course, we still have 7.5 weeks to go, so you don't count those chickens before they're hatched. But it's obviously more likely of a reality than it was 3 weeks ago. So you start having those conversations, just the basic blocking and tackling. We would move to Tallahassee full time. We made that decision from the very beginning before we even decided to jump into this race. And so, where do you want to live? Ava will be finishing 5th grade in the spring. She'll finish there no matter what. And then, where do you want to go to middle school next year? All the basic life decisions that you've got to figure out. And of course, I have had the benefit of being in Tallahassee for 8 years, but it's, I know there's different worlds. You've got the Tallahassee world that revolves around the orbit of the legislature, and there's a whole other world of people that live there full time, and figuring out how that all works out. They're eager. They've been great partners in letting me do what I've done the last 8 years. You look at, was it 2015, 2016, when we had both a budget special session and the 2 redistricting sessions, and we did the early session. I figured it out. I was in Tallahassee 42 weeks of the 52 weeks that year. And so, they really learned to be invested in partners in getting this done. And I think they're eager and excited about, the possibility of what this next phase holds for us as a family.
And then before we ask you to sort of wrap up, and we're going to hear from you, at our general reception a little bit later this evening. So can you share with us any of your favorite books? You probably haven't had a whole lot of time to do summer reading this year, but favorite books, any role models that sort of help you, have a lodestar for, the types of leader you want to be?
I have not had enough time to read. I really love. If people ask, what do you do? And I tell them I used to read, I used to play golf, I used to go hunting. I don't do any of those things anymore. In fact, I couldn't even tell you where my golf clubs are. I literally don't know which place they're at right now.
I had 3 partners in our scramble for charity yesterday that wish I didn't have golf clubs. So.
Oh my! So it has been tough. I did get to read a little bit during the winter time. I took a little bit off. I read is it Dan Abrams, the Tudors, and then the one before that, the Plantagenets. Always interesting to read. It really is fascinating when you read history and you read those books, especially illuminated the conflicts that happen with, kings and their courts and their subjects, and just how lucky we are, frankly, to live in a country where we have an elective representation, because essentially the people were speaking, but instead of having an orderly election every 4 years. It would build up until they decided the way to solve this was to grab the guy by the coattails and throw him in the river and chop his head off. They were getting done what they wanted to get done. It just was not a pretty sight, and certainly I think gives us some perspective when we get maybe a little too worried about what happens nowadays in 2018. We were talking earlier about politics maybe seems a little rough nowadays, and I always like to remind people that when Jefferson and Adams ran against each other, Jefferson's called Adams a hermaphrodite in his newspaper. And then after they were elected, the sitting vice president of the United States of America shot and killed the previous secretary of the Treasury in a duel later that year. So I really think that gives a lot of perspective to, maybe things aren't quite as terrible as some people would make them out to be. A lot of words, but not really all that bad. So it's, that tends to be my focus on history when I'm particularly looking for something to relax to and read about.
Yeah, Churchill famously said the difference between politics and war was in politics you could be fatally wounded at least 9 times and survive. And so we're going to hear from our CFO next, who's also a good friend of yours and ours. Tell us why, not just the business community, which we've endorsed you today, why the business community can support you in a significant way these next couple weeks. And what can they be doing to help?
Well, the easy answer to the second part is have the financial capacity and resources to communicate that message. We go, it's the lament we did here we share on the trail with each other that, I will have spent somewhere north of 70 weeks to talk to 1.4 million people with a field of folks that I agree on 90% of the issues with. And then we turn around and we've got 10 weeks to talk to 8 million people against people with whom I probably only agree about 10% of the issues. It seems disproportionately out of scale. But to do that, to talk to that many people in this short amount of time, we obviously need financial resources, and that's the biggest and most significant help. Obviously, on the side of what does this look like, I think we covered it well in your initial questions, Mr. Speaker. My 2 biggest focuses are going to be the jobs that are related to the enormous scope of this office. And making sure that that's done well, and that's done with an eye towards the success and growth of our economy. To build off the point you made earlier with Ashley Moody, that a successful economy helps everything. It's kind of like a marriage. You can have issues, but if things are going well, you can look past those. And for what is a marriage of 22 million of us, if the economy's working, we can figure out the other issues, and that's really the fundamental. We've seen Rick Scott make that the fundamental of his time over the last 8 years, and I think you've got a bunch of folks who have become acolytes of that perspective, that is the foundation that you build all the rest of your political positions and success or failure upon. And then obviously water, as I said, and all the ways that takes us, natural resources, the beautiful bounty that we have as an state. My predecessor, Adam Putnam, I loved, he would make the statement that if we didn't have Disney World, if we didn't have beaches, we'd be world famous for our springs, because we're also completely unique from the rest of the globe and that bounty. So we really are blessed to overflowing, and I certainly plan to do everything I can to not only maintain that, but to improve it and look back on these 8 years of success.
Well, you've been a great friend of the business community, and we are very excited to be supporting you for the next 7.5 weeks and working with you well beyond that tenure. So thanks, and congratulations on all the AIF awards.